He found the orc warrior slumped against his barn, a dark shape barely visible in the driving rain. Then she looked down at the small oilcloth-wrapped bundle in her arms, and her voice, a gravelly whisper torn from a throat raw with pain, begged him, "She's all I have left. Please." Elias held the lantern higher, its flickering light casting long, dancing shadows that made the night seem even more menacing. Rain plastered his thin hair to his scalp and ran in cold rivulets down his neck. He should have said no. He should have barred the door and gone back to his cold hearth and pretended he'd seen nothing but a wind-thrown branch. That was the sensible thing to do. Orcs were trouble. They were the jagged peaks of the mountains made flesh, hard, unforgiving, and best viewed from a great distance. Bringing one into his home, especially a wounded one, was like inviting a rock slide into his living space. The wind howled, whipping the rain into a horizontal spray that stung his face. The lantern flame trembled, threatening to die and leave him in the roaring dark. The orc's head lolled against the weathered wood of the barn. Her armor, a patchwork of dented iron plates and boiled leather, was dark with rain and something thicker. Blood. A lot of it. A crude bandage of torn hide was wrapped around her thigh, but it was soaked through, a black stain spreading across the faded green of her skin. Her tusks, shorter than a male's but still wickedly sharp, jutted from her lower lip. One was chipped at the tip. He had lived alone for 10 years, alone since Martha had been taken by the winter fever. His world had shrunk to the boundaries of his small farm, the field he tilled, the forest he foraged, the barn he maintained, and the small, stone-walled house that held more memories than warmth. It was a quiet life, a predictable life of calloused hands and an aching back. It was a safe life. This woman, this creature of the high peaks and bloody conflicts, was the antithesis of all that. Her eyes, the colour of moss in deep shade, found his again. They were clouded with pain, but held a fierce, desperate light. She tried to push the bundle towards him, a weak, clumsy gesture. A small whimper came from within the oilcloth. A child. It was a child. That changed things. It changed everything. Elias felt the familiar, rusty lock on his heart give a painful turn. He had buried a child once. A small, silent bundle, wrapped in his best wool blanket. He had dug the grave himself, the frozen ground fighting him for every inch. He lowered the lantern, his decision made not in his head, but in some deep, hollow place in his chest. The sensible thing be damned. "Inside," he said, his own voice sounding rough from disuse. "Get inside." He didn't offer a hand. He wasn't a fool. She was still an orc, and a winded animal was at its most dangerous. But he held the door to his small house open, the lantern light spilling out onto the muddy ground, a fragile invitation against the vast, hostile dark. She moved with a groan of agony, using the barn wall to haul herself upright. She leaned heavily on her good leg, dragging the other. Each step was a monumental effort. She didn't complain, didn't make a sound beyond the harsh rasp of her breathing. She just moved, her entire focus on getting the child into the light, into the shelter. Inside, the house was sparse. A stone hearth, a a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, a bed in the corner, and shelves holding a few clay pots and his leather working tools. The air smelled of wood smoke, old leather, and loneliness. He set the lantern on the table, the light stabilizing, pushing the shadows into the corners. The orc woman stumbled to the hearth and sank onto the floor, her back against the cool stones. She unwrapped the bundle with trembling fingers. Inside, nestled in a bed of worn furs, was a small orc child, no more than 2 years old. The little girl had her mother's green skin and a shock of black hair. She wasn't crying, just watching the strange, flickering world with wide, dark eyes. Elias moved to the hearth and added a few logs to the glowing embers. He worked the bellows until flames licked up, catching the dry wood. Warmth began to seep into the room, a welcome counterpoint to the storm rattling the shutters. He did not look at the orcs. He focused on the fire, on the familiar task. It was easier that way. "I have water," he said, still not looking at her, "and some broth." A grunt was his only reply. He filled a kettle from the water barrel by the door and hung it on the hook over the fire. While it heated, he fetched his medical supplies, a small box containing clean linen, a jar of willow bark tonic for pain, and another of a pungent, herb-infused salve for wounds. He had used them on his livestock and on himself more times than he could count. He placed them on the floor near her, but not too near, an offering. She watched him, her hand never leaving the hilt of the short, heavy-bladed sword at her hip. Her suspicion was a palpable thing, thick as the smoke from a damp fire. He understood it. In her world, kindness from a human was likely a trap. "The leg," he said, nodding towards the wounded limb. "It needs cleaning, or you'll lose it, or your life." She stared at him, her jaw tight. A silent battle was being waged behind those moss-green eyes. Trust a human, or die of her wound. He could see the calculation, the weighing of risks. He turned away, giving her space. He ladled the warm water into a bowl and took a piece of day-old bread from the shelf. He didn't have much. A little salted pork, some dried beans, half a loaf of bread. Enough for one, barely enough for 3. He dipped the bread in the water and held it out, not to the mother, but to the child. The little girl looked at her mother. The warrior gave a short, almost imperceptible nod. The child reached out with a chubby green hand and took the bread. She gnawed on it, her small, undeveloped tusks scraping the crust. That simple act seemed to break something in the mother. The iron wall of her composure cracked. A long, shuddering breath escaped her lips. "Go ahead," she rasped, her voice like stones grinding together. She gestured to the wound. Elias knelt. He was a farmer, a mender of harnesses and worn-out boots, not a healer. But he knew torn flesh and broken things. He carefully cut away the ruined bandage and the leather trousers beneath. The wound was ugly. A deep, jagged gash that ran from her upper thigh almost to her knee. It was caked with mud and pine needles, the work of a sword, or perhaps an axe. It was stitched crudely in a few places with what looked like sinew, but the stitches had torn loose. He worked in silence, cleaning the wound with warm water and linen strips. She hissed in pain when he probed for debris, her hand tightening on her sword, but she didn't stop him. He could feel the heat of infection already starting to build in the flesh. He crushed some willow bark and mixed it with water, offering it to her. She drank it down without question. Finally, he coated the entire wound in the green, strong-smelling salve and bound it tightly with fresh linen. His work done, he sat back on his heels. His knees ached. He was getting old. "Thank you," she said. The words were quiet, forced, as if they were foreign to her tongue. "Don't thank me yet," he replied, getting to his feet. "Fever will come. That will be the test." He gave them his bed. It was the only one he had. The orc woman protested with a glare, but she was too weak to argue. He helped her move, his hands briefly touching the hard muscle of her arm. She felt like she was carved from wood and stone. He took a spare blanket for himself and settled into a chair by the fire, his old hunting axe resting against the wall beside him. He did not expect to sleep. The storm raged on through the night. The fever came, as he had predicted. She thrashed in his bed, muttering in a harsh, guttural language he didn't understand. The child, Kiri, he learned her name was from the mother's fevered whispers, never left her side. She lay curled against her mother's good leg, a small, silent guardian. Elias spent the night bathing the warrior's face with cool water and forcing more of the willow bark tonic between her lips. He wasn't sure why he was doing it. Pity. Atonement for a past he couldn't change. Or maybe just the simple, stubborn refusal to let death have another victory under his roof. Towards dawn, the fever broke. The storm outside quieted to a steady drizzle. The orc warrior, Gruna he now knew her name to be, lay still, her breathing deep and even. She was slick with sweat, but she was alive. Elias felt a profound sense of relief, followed immediately by a surge of apprehension. He had saved her. Now, what in the world was he going to do with her? The days that followed fell into a strange, silent routine. Gruna healed with a speed that astonished him. Orcs were made of tougher stuff than humans, it seemed. While she was confined to the bed, he tended to the farm, milked his single goat, and prepared their meager meals. He would leave a bowl of broth or stew by the bed, and when he returned, it would be empty. They rarely spoke. Words seemed unnecessary and perhaps dangerous. Kiri was the bridge between their two silent worlds. She was a curious child, unafraid of him. She would watch him with her solemn eyes as he mended a leather strap or sharpened a tool. He carved her a small wooden bird, a clumsy thing, but she clutched it in her hand as if it were a treasure. He found himself speaking to her sometimes, soft, simple words about the goat or the chickens. Her mother would watch from the bed, her expression unreadable. When Gruna was able to walk again, limping heavily, she did not remain idle. One morning he came in from the fields to find she had taken his axe and chopped a neat pile of firewood, more than he would chop in a week. Another day, she re-thatched a leaking patch on his roof, her movements deft and sure despite her injury. She did not ask. She simply saw what needed doing and did it. It was a language he understood better than words, a language of work, of contribution, of earning one's keep. He came to learn her rhythms. She was a creature of discipline. She rose before the sun, even when wounded, to perform a series of slow, deliberate stretches. She sharpened her sword every evening until the edge was keen enough to shave with. She was teaching the child, too, not reading or writing, but tracking, listening. She would point to a bird's nest in the eaves or a deer track in the mud, whispering to Kiri in their own tongue. She was preparing her daughter for a world he could barely imagine. One evening they sat by the fire. The silence was comfortable now, not tense. He was re-stitching the sole of his boot, his hands moving in the familiar, practiced motions. Gruna was cleaning her armor, rubbing a piece of sandstone against a rust spot on her pauldron. "You are skilled," she said, her voice low. "With the leather." Elias grunted, not looking up. "My father was a tanner, his father before him. It's in the blood, I suppose." "My father was a chief," she said, her voice flat. "He taught me to fight, said a blade was a better inheritance than land." It was the most she had ever offered about her past. He risked a glance at her. Her face was grim in the firelight, the chipped tusk a stark white against her green skin. "Seems he was right," Elias said quietly. A bitter smile touched her lips. "He was wrong. A blade can be taken. Land? Land endures." She looked around the small, simple room. "This is your land." "It's not much," he said, "but it's mine." "It is everything," she replied, and there was a deep, aching weariness in her voice that resonated with the hollow place in his own chest. That night, he found her awake when he went to bank the fire. She was standing by the small window, looking out at the moonlit fields. She had taken to sleeping on a pile of furs by the hearth, insisting he take his own bed back. Kiri was asleep in a small nest of blankets nearby. "They will come for us," she said, not turning. "I know." "They will kill you for helping me." He had thought of that every day. The fear was a cold knot in his stomach, but the idea of telling her to leave, of sending her and the child back out into the wilderness, was worse. "Let them try," he said, the words sounding braver than he felt. She turned then and looked at him, truly looked at him. Her gaze was intense, searching. It felt as if she were peeling back the layers of him, the farmer, the widower, the lonely old man, and seeing something else underneath, something he himself had forgotten was there. "You are a strange human, Elias," she said. "Lady, if I had tricks, I wouldn't live like this." She almost smiled. It was a fleeting thing, but it changed her face, softening the hard lines for just a moment. "My name is Gruna." "I know," he said. A few days later, the first sign appeared, a symbol carved into the fence post at the far end of his pasture. It was a tusk, broken in the middle. Gruna saw it, and her face became a mask of cold fury. "Gorak," she hissed. "His mark." "A rival?" Elias asked. "The butcher who killed my meat," she said, her voice like iron breaking. "The one who took my clan." The peace they had built, fragile as a spider's web, was torn. The quiet domesticity was over. The violent intrusion had begun. That night they didn't sleep. Gruna stood watch by the window, her sword in her hand. Elias sat at the table, cleaning his old hunting spear, the one he hadn't used in years. The house was no longer a sanctuary. It was a trap, waiting to be sprung. The next day she took him to the edge of the woods. She moved with a hunter's grace, her limp barely noticeable now. She pointed to the ground, to a patch of mud he would have overlooked. A footprint, large, booted, clearly an orc's, and another, a patrol, scouts. 2 of them, she said. They are testing the perimeter. They will be back, with more. What do we do? He asked. His heart was hammering against his ribs. We don't wait for them to come to the door, she said, her eyes scanning the terrain. Your farm, you know it best. Where is a man most vulnerable here? He thought for a moment, his fear giving way to a farmer's practical knowledge. The old creek bed, just north of the barn. It's deep, overgrown with thorn bushes, a good place for an ambush. She nodded, a grim look of approval on her face. Show me. They spent the afternoon preparing. It felt wrong, turning his home into a killing ground. The familiar paths and hollows he knew from decades of work now looked different, assessed for tactical advantage. He showed her the weak spot in the stone wall, the loose floorboard in the hayloft, the way the creek curved to hide a man from view. He was the expert here, in his own small world, and she listened, her head cocked, absorbing the information. That evening, as dusk bled across the sky, they came. 3 of them this time. They moved arrogantly, crashing through the underbrush, confident in their strength. They wore the same broken tusk symbol on their armor. Gruna met them in the open field between the forest and the barn. Elias was hidden in the hayloft, his old bow in his hands, an arrow nocked. His palms were sweating so much he could barely keep his grip. Kiri was hidden in the root cellar beneath the house, told not to make a sound. Gorak sends his whelps to do a man's job, Gruna called out, her voice ringing with authority across the field. The lead orc, a brute with a scarred face, laughed. The chieftain sends us to collect his property, you and the girl. He will be generous and let the human live, if he stays in his hovel. I am no one's property, Gruna snarled. The fight was sudden and brutal. She moved like a storm, a whirlwind of green skin and flashing steel. She was outnumbered, but she was faster, smarter. She used her smaller size to her advantage, ducking under a wild swing and hamstringing one of the orcs. He went down with a roar of pain. That was Elias's cue. He drew the bowstring back, the old yew creaking in protest. He aimed for the second orc, the one turning to help his fallen comrade. He aimed for the thick chest. He released. The arrow flew true, thudding into the orc's shoulder. It wasn't a killing blow, but it staggered him, made him cry out in surprise and pain. It was the opening Gruna needed. She spun, her sword a blur, and took the third orc's head from his shoulders in a single, devastating strike. The wounded scout on the ground tried to crawl away, but she dispatched him with a cold, efficient thrust. The second, the one Elias had shot, stared at his dead companions, then at the fury in Gruna's eyes, and then he turned and fled back into the woods. Gruna let him go. A messenger. She stood in the twilight, breathing heavily, splattered with blood. The setting sun glinted off her sword. She looked magnificent and terrifying. She looked up at the hayloft, and their eyes met across the field. He saw respect in her gaze, and something more. He lowered the bow, his body trembling with adrenaline and horror. He had just helped kill 2 beings. The quiet farmer was gone. In his place was something else, something he didn't recognize. They buried the bodies in the woods, under the cover of darkness. They worked together, the sound of their shovels digging into the soft earth the only noise in the night. When they were done, they returned to the house. The smell of blood lingered in the air. Neither of them could sleep. Kiri was back from the cellar, sensing the tension, clinging to her mother. "You saved my life," Gruna said, breaking the silence. She was cleaning her sword, her movements methodical. "You saved mine," he replied, staring into the fire. "They would have killed me eventually." "He will come himself now," she said. "Gorak. He will not send scouts again. He will bring his war party." "How many?" 20, maybe more. Too many for a hayloft and an old bow. A sense of hopelessness settled over him. His farm, his world was about to be obliterated. "We should run." "There is nowhere to run," she said, her voice heavy. "He would hunt us to the end of the world. My daughter will never be safe while he lives." She looked at Kiri, who had fallen asleep in her lap. Her expression softened, the warrior replaced by the mother. "She is all I have left." The words echoed the first thing she had ever said to him, that night in the rain. Before, it had been a plea. Now it was a statement of fact, a reason to fight, a reason to die. "Then we stand," Elias said. No. He had not meant to say it. The words had come from that same place that had opened his door to her in the first place. A place deeper than reason, deeper than fear. Gruna looked at him, her eyes wide with surprise. "Stand. Human, you saw what is coming. They will burn this house to the ground with us inside." "It's just a house," he said, and he was surprised to find that he meant it. The stone and wood held memories, but they were just things. The living, breathing woman and child in front of him, they were something else. "It's my land. They are not welcome on it." A strange, fierce pride filled him. It was a foreign feeling, but not an unpleasant one. For 10 years he had been passively enduring life. Now he was choosing to face death. The next 2 days were a blur of frantic preparation. They fortified the small house as best they could, barring the windows and reinforcing the door. Elias knew it was a fool's errand. A stone house couldn't stand against a score of angry orcs. It was a gesture, nothing more. A way to feel like they were doing something other than waiting for the end. The war party arrived on the 3rd day at dawn. They came out of the mist-shrouded forest like ghosts, their armor black and menacing, the broken tusk sigil painted on their shields. At their head was a massive orc with a twisted, scarred face and a cruel glint in his eyes. Gorak. He rode a huge, shaggy beast that looked like a cross between a boar and a wolf. They surrounded the house, a silent, disciplined ring of death. "Gruna!" Gorak's voice boomed, a sound full of gravel and malice. "You have led me a merry chase, but the game is over. Come out, give me the child, and I will grant you a swift death. Defy me, and I will burn this farm to ash and salt the earth where it stood." Elias stood by the barred window, his knuckles white where he gripped his spear. Beside him, Gruna was a statue of defiance. "He calls you chieftain in exile," Elias said, the words of the scout from the first fight suddenly clicking into place. "You're not just a warrior." Gruna didn't look at him. Her eyes were fixed on Gorak. "I was the chosen heir of the Iron Tusk clan. My mate was the chieftain's son. Gorak was his war master. He murdered them both, my father, my mate. He wanted the clan for himself. I escaped with Kiri, his only living heir." The full truth landed on him like a physical blow. He wasn't just hiding a fugitive. He was sheltering royalty, a queen and her princess. And he, a simple farmer, had been caught in the middle of a war for a throne. He felt a sudden, sharp sting of betrayal. She had used him, his home, his kindness. He was a pawn in her game. He felt small, insignificant, a fool. "You should have told me," he said, his voice cold. "Would you have helped me if you knew?" She shot back, her voice sharp. "Or would you have turned me away, afraid of a war that wasn't yours?" He didn't have an answer for that. He didn't know. Outside, Gorak was growing impatient. "I will not ask again, Gruna." The attack began. It was not a battle. It was a siege. Orcs hammered on the door with a heavy log. Others threw flaming torches onto the thatched roof. Smoke began to fill the small house, choking them. The heat was immense. Through a crack in the window shutter, Elias watched his world burn. The barn caught fire first, the old wood going up with a roar. The chickens scattered, squawking in terror. His goat bleated, trapped in its pen. A profound sadness washed over him, eclipsing the fear. 10 years of his life turning to ash. "The cellar!" Gruna yelled over the din, grabbing Kiri. "We can hold them at the door." They retreated down the stone steps into the cool, dark earth. The cellar was small, smelling of damp soil and stored potatoes. The heavy oak door at the top of the stairs was their only defense. Soon, they heard the house door splinter and crash inwards. Heavy boots stomped on the floorboards above them. "She's down here," an orc shouted. They began to hammer on the cellar door. The thick wood shuddered with each blow. Elias and Gruna braced their backs against it, their shoulders pressed together. In the cramped, smoky dark, he could feel the warmth of her, the solid strength. His anger, his feeling of betrayal melted away. It didn't matter who she was. It only mattered that they were here, together, about to die. Just as the door began to splinter, a new sound cut through the chaos. A war horn. A different one. Deep, resonant and loud. It came from the east, from the hills behind the farm. The hammering on the door stopped. Shouts of confusion and alarm came from the house above. Elias and Gruna exchanged a look of disbelief. Then the sounds of a new battle erupted outside, the clash of steel, the roars of fighting orcs. My loyalists, Gruner breathed, a look of fierce, incredulous hope on her face. They found me. They burst out of the cellar into the burning ruin of the house. The air was thick with smoke and embers. Outside, the scene was chaos. A second force of orcs, these bearing the sigil of a single unbroken tusk, had crashed into Gorak's flank. They were outnumbered, but they fought with a desperate ferocity. They were all female warriors, Elias noted, moving with a fluid, deadly grace. Gorak roared in fury, rallying his men. He spotted Gruner as she emerged from the house, a silhouette against the flames. "Witch, you led them to me," he bellowed, charging towards her. Gruner met his charge. Their blades met with a clang that rang over the din of the battle. They were a whirlwind of motion, Gorak's brute strength against her speed and skill. Elias stood, momentarily useless, armed with a farmer's spear against a battle-hardened war chief. He saw one of Gorak's warriors break away, moving to flank Gruner while she was engaged. Without thinking, Elias charged. He drove his spear forward with all his strength. The orc, surprised by the attack from a mere human, turned too late. The iron spearhead punched through his leather armor, sinking deep into his side. The orc gasped, his eyes wide with shock, and collapsed. Elias stared at the fallen orc, at the blood on his hands. He had killed again. But there was no time for horror. The battle raged around him. He pulled his spear free and stood his ground, a lone human farmer amidst a clash of orc titans. The fight was turning. Gruner's loyalists, though fewer in number, were elite. They were cutting through Gorak's forces. Gorak, seeing his advantage slipping, fought with renewed savagery. He disarmed Gruner with a powerful blow, sending her sword flying. He raised his axe for the final strike. It was in that moment, with death hanging in the balance, that she did the unthinkable. She looked past Gorak, past the battle, and her eyes found Elias. "Elias!" she shouted, her voice clear and commanding, cutting through the chaos. "To me! I name you shield-mate of the Iron Tusk. I claim you before my ancestors and my enemies. Your life is bound to mine." The battle seemed to hold its breath. Orcs from both sides turned to stare. Gorak hesitated, his axe held aloft, a look of utter disbelief on his face. To claim a human, a male, a farmer as a shieldmate, the highest honor, a bond deeper than marriage, was unheard of. It was madness. It was an insult to their traditions, to their very way of life. "You would disgrace your bloodline with this thing," Gorak spat, gesturing at Elias with his axe. Elias felt the weight of every eye on him. He was no warrior. He was a man with a spear, standing in the ashes of his life. But in Gruner's eyes, he saw something that transcended status, or species, or skill. He saw a choice. She was choosing him, not as a savior, not as a warrior, but as him, the man who had given her shelter, the man who had stood. He walked forward through the carnage until he stood beside her. He was half a head shorter than her, wiry where she was powerful. He felt utterly out of place, yet he had never felt more certain of where he was supposed to be. He looked not at Gruner, but at Gorak. "I accept," he said, his voice quiet but steady. That act of defiance, so unexpected, so contrary to all their laws of honor and strength, shattered Gorak's composure. He roared in pure, frustrated rage and swung his axe wildly at Gruna. But the moment's hesitation had cost him. One of Gruna's loyalists, a tall warrior with a long scar across her face, drove her spear through his back. Gorak stiffened, a look of surprise on his face. He dropped his axe and fell to his knees, then pitched forward into the mud. Silence fell over the battlefield, broken only by the crackle of the burning farmhouse and the groans of the wounded. The surviving members of Gorak's war party threw down their weapons and knelt in submission. Gruna stood tall, her chest heaving. She was no longer an exile. She was a chieftain. She turned to Elias, her expression serious. "My offer was not made in desperation," she said, her voice carrying to every warrior present. "It was made in respect. I offer you a place at my side, in my home, in my clan." Elias looked at the smoking ruins of his house, at the bodies littering his field. His old life was gone, utterly and irrevocably. There was nothing left for him here but ghosts. He looked at Gruna, at the strength and honor in her face. He looked at Kiri, who was being held by one of the female warriors, safe at last. "I will come with you," he said, "but not as a pet, not as some human curiosity you protect. I am not a warrior. I am a farmer, a tanner, a craftsman. I will work. I will earn my place. I will stand beside you, not behind you." The tall warrior who had killed Gorak snorted in derision, but Gruna silenced her with a look. She studied Elias's face, and a slow, genuine smile spread across her lips. "That is all I have ever asked of anyone," she said, "to stand beside me." They left the next morning. They did not look back at the blackened timbers and scorched earth that had once been his home. They walked east towards the jagged peaks of the mountains, a strange procession of orc warriors, their new chieftain, and a human farmer who had somehow found his place in a world he never knew existed. The journey to the hidden encampment of the Iron Tusk loyalists was arduous. Elias was not accustomed to the harsh mountain terrain. His boots, which had served him well on his flat farmland, were quickly shredded by the sharp rocks. His muscles ached with a deep, burning fatigue. But he did not complain. He watched, he learned, and he endured. He faced suspicion and outright hostility from the other orcs. They saw him as a weakness, a liability. The tall warrior, whose name was Urka, was the most vocal. She saw his presence at Gruna's side as an affront. "He cannot fight," she argued one night around their campfire. "He cannot keep pace. He is soft. He will get you killed, chieftain." "He stood against Gorak's scouts with nothing but an old bow," Gruna countered, her voice calm but firm. "He stood beside me against a war party with nothing but a spear and his courage." Strength is not only measured in the swing of an axe, Urka. There is strength in the heart, and his is iron. The words silenced the dissent, but not the suspicion. Elias knew he had to prove her right. He could not compete with them in strength or battle prowess, so he used the skills he had. He noticed the straps on Urka's shoulder guard were frayed. That night, while she slept, he took it, carefully re-stitched it with waxed thread, and reinforced the worn leather with a new patch. He left it by her sleeping roll. She never mentioned it, but he saw the way she tested the repair, the grudging respect in her eyes. He repaired their worn-out boots. He used his knowledge of herbs to create a poultice that eased the ache in their muscles. He showed them how to build better, more efficient cooking fires that produced less smoke. Small things, practical things, the quiet work of a man who knew how to make things last. Slowly, grudgingly, they began to see him not as a human, but as Elias, a man of use, a man of quiet worth. Their camp was a hidden fortress in a high mountain valley. Here, Gruna began the difficult task of rebuilding her clan. She was a natural leader, wise and just, but she carried the weight of her people's future on her shoulders. Elias watched her, saw the exhaustion behind the iron facade. He found his own role. He was not a warrior or a counselor or a chief. He was a builder. He organized the construction of new, sturdier shelters. He established a small terraced garden to grow hardy mountain vegetables. He built a tanning station to make better leather for armor and clothing. He worked from sunup to sundown, his hands always busy, his mind focused. In work, he found his purpose, and in that purpose, he found a new kind of peace. Months passed. The seasons began to turn. The camp thrived under Gruna's rule, and with the foundation of stability he helped to build. The suspicion of the other orcs had faded, replaced by a quiet acceptance. He was part of them now, as strange as that still seemed. One evening, Gruna came to the small hut he had built for himself. She was preparing for a council with the elders of other clans, seeking alliances. She wore the ceremonial armor of her station, but one of the clasps on her vambrace was broken. "Can you fix this?" she asked, holding out her arm. He took her arm in his hands. It was the same arm he had first held so long ago to help her into his house. The skin was the same shade of green, the muscles just as hard. But everything was different. There was no fear between them now, no suspicion, only a deep, comfortable trust. He took the vambrace to his small workbench. He heated the metal in his forge, a small clay furnace he had built, and carefully hammered the broken clasp back into shape. He polished the metal until it shone, stronger than before. He returned to her and knelt to fasten it on her arm. His fingers brushed against her skin. The memory of cleaning her wound that first night in his house flashed in his mind. He had been a reluctant caregiver then, tending to a dangerous stranger. Now he was an equal, a partner, preparing his chieftain for her duties. She looked down at him, her moss-green eyes soft in the firelight. "You have built a home here, Elias." "No," he said, meeting her gaze. He secured the clasp and let his hand rest on her arm for a moment longer. "I lost my home. I found it again when I found you." She placed her other hand over his. Her touch was warm, her grip firm. Outside, Kiri's laughter could be heard as she played a game with the other orc children. It was a sound of peace, of a future earned through fire and blood, and a simple, uncharacteristic choice made on a rainy night. He had been a man defined by what he had lost. Now, he was a man defined by what he had chosen to stand for, and who he had chosen to stand beside. Did you enjoy the story? Subscribe to the channel to watch more stories like this one. Leave a like, it helps the channel a lot. And drop a comment down below. I always read them and use your feedback to make our content better. Thanks so much. Orc-bound legacy.